He's the Russian oligarch who took Chelsea Football Club to new heights during his 19 years as owner. But now the UK government is threatening to sue Roman Abramovich over the £2.5 billion he made from selling the club, which lies frozen in a bank. So why is the British government preparing to take legal action? And can they really win against a multi-billionaire? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the UK says it's fully prepared to take Roman Abramovich to court over his billions of pounds frozen in a UK bank after he sold Chelsea Football Club. The government wants that money to go towards rebuilding Ukraine, but Abramovich wants it to go towards all victims of the war. So, what will happen to his billions, and is this a matter which can ever be resolved?
Chelsea had become a club used to winning. Its success down to this man, Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, who bought the club in 2003. In the ensuing 19 years under his ownership, they won many titles, including 2 Champions Leagues and 5 Premier League titles. Abramovich transformed not just the club, but English football, injecting billions into buying new players, hiring managers and improving training facilities. Fast forward to 2022, Russia goes to war with Ukraine, and the oligarch is sanctioned, forcing him to sell the club to a tune of £2.5 billion. Abramovich said proceeds from the sale would be donated via a foundation for the benefit of all victims of the war in Ukraine, including Russians. But the government pushed back and argued the money should be exclusively for Ukrainians, leading to a 3-year legal standstill. Now the government is threatening to sue the oligarch to acquire the funds. In a rare joint statement, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Foreign Secretary said, "We are deeply frustrated that it has not been possible to reach an agreement on this with Mr. Abramovich so far. While the door for negotiations will remain open, we are fully prepared to pursue this through the courts if required, to ensure people suffering in Ukraine can benefit from these proceeds as soon as possible." Legally, the funds still belong to Abramovich, despite being frozen, so the government may struggle to legally compel him to hand over the money. So who would win this legal battle?
Well, let's meet our guests. I'm delighted to say joining me here in the studio is Nina dos Santos. She's a journalist and the podcast host of Ctrl, Alt, Deceit. And Lance Santos, TRT World sports correspondent, is with us as well. And in London, we have Tan Al-Bayrak. He's an international trade lawyer with a focus on economic sanctions. You're very welcome to this roundtable. Nina, to you, I remember Abramovich coming to London out of nowhere. Nobody was complaining 25 years ago when this guy was splashing money around like water.
That's right, in 2003. But before that, he wasn't very well known. And in many ways, he's a big man of mystery, but also somebody who's very prominent on the international stage, largely because of these huge ostentatious displays of wealth that he was famous for in London and elsewhere around the world back in those days. Remember, he's the ultimate, forget Jeff Bezos, he's the ultimate owner of the biggest super yachts in the world. You'd see him across the Mediterranean. You'd also see him on Bond Street, which is where all the luxury jewellery chains are, flanked with bodyguards going up and down the street shopping, with a loved one, but he wouldn't say much. So lots of Londoners began to ask, well, who is this mysterious, apparently politically connected, wealthy Russian who's buying up swathes of property, big football clubs? It turns out that actually he is somebody who has made his wealth in oil at a very tender age. Aged just 29 years old, he was able to acquire for a few $100 million Sibneft, which was one of the biggest oil companies at a time when Russia was coming out of communism. The most important connection he probably made in his entire life was with the late oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who was very close to Boris Yeltsin, the then Russian president, and he was able to help Roman Abramovich move from a small-time oil trader into the big time, and he's able, and has been able to keep in with successive Russian presidents, of which there has only been one since, and that, of course, is Vladimir Putin. But his proximity to the current government and the Kremlin, at the moment, the current government in Russia, has been one of the main reasons behind the decision back in 2022, after the onset of war in Ukraine, to sanction him. And Chelsea Football Club has been the jewel in the crown here, especially in the UK, with regards to making very, very clear from the government's point of view that, you know, Kremlin-connected wealth is not welcome in the UK after the onset of war in Ukraine.
Tan, morally, legally, should we be taking money off people that some people clearly don't like?
So I don't know about morally, but legally, as you're aware, when Abramovich got sanctioned in 2012 by the UK, Chelsea was also impacted because per sanctions laws, when an individual gets sanctioned, entities he owns or controls are also automatically sanctioned. You know, so Chelsea was subject to that same asset freeze of Mr. Abramovich. By extension, this freeze also attached to the sale proceeds from the club, which are Abramovich assets, as the proceeds would have normally been in his bank account for him to use if he were not sanctioned. You know, recently, when Abramovich expressed a wish to use the proceeds toward, you know, all victims of the war from both, you know, Russia and Ukraine, I believe Rachel Rees stated it would, it could take that the UK government could take court action if necessary to compel the funds mobilization toward this whole Ukraine use. Now, the actual legal basis of all this is a bit unclear, and this is for both sides. You know, normally neither Abramovich nor the UK government or anyone really, for that matter, has the capacity to move these funds around with the application of the current asset freeze laws. You know, sanctions have traditionally been viewed as a temporary measure because they can be, and in fact they are from time to time, revoked by imposing countries or get overturned through appeal. And if the sanctions designation of a sanctioned individual is removed, the frozen assets are automatically made available again to that same individual. So in that sense, the sale proceeds of Chelsea are technically Abramovich assets. It is just he cannot use them due to the asset freeze measures. By the same token, the UK government also cannot use them because they are frozen Abramovich assets. Now, all these comments I'm making are informed by how, you know, sanctions laws have been applied thus far. You know, this is simply how asset freeze targets have historically been targeted. But then again, we are navigating uncharted waters. You know, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been an emotionally charged topic. So who knows if this would bring about a paradigm shift in certain legal approaches in the West as we know it.
Thanks, Tan. And Nina, just to be clear, going back over the decades, he spent an awful lot of money in the UK and nobody had a problem accepting it. Lawyers.
He and other Russian oligarchs.
Yes.
I used to follow the Russian oligarchs and interview many of them back in the early 2000s, because up until about 2008, they used to have their conferences in London. There was a big forum called the Russian Economic Forum that used to take place in a building just a stone's throw away from the Houses of Parliament. And they all would congregate here until eventually, and I remember it was upon the death of Boris Yeltsin, it was that time that Vladimir Putin signalled he wanted to shift all of those type of conversations to St. Petersburg, set up a rival economic forum, which is like the Davos of Russia, and things have continued over there. And since then, you've seen this sort of pivot of this bunch of Russian oligarchs. There were more of them. They have been brought closer to the Kremlin. Many of them have probably been told, look, you have to keep your nose out of politics and, you know, share probably some of the wealth that you've made in your companies with either the Kremlin or people connected to the Kremlin, or more of it with Russia. And it's that sort of Faustian contract that those who say people like Abramovich should be sanctioned, its businesses should be sanctioned, it's that Faustian contract that they're trying to highlight, apparently.
Lance, Nina calls Chelsea the jewel in the crown for Abramovich, and it was, because he came in, Chelsea having not really achieved that much for a very long time, and out of nowhere, he made them winners.
Well, absolutely. Chelsea, it's important to remember where they were before Abramovich came in. They were considered a cup team obviously they had some success. Their last league title was in 1955. And if you look at the injection of capital that was put in and the ruthless pursuit of trophies, not only did he win a Premier League title in his second season, obviously going on to reach 5 Champions League semi-finals in his first 6 seasons. That put Chelsea on the map, not just domestically in the UK, but they were recognised across Europe now. He spent an awful amount, $2.7 billion over his reign, his 19-year reign at Chelsea, on players. He went and got the best. He got the best coaches. You saw that with Jose Mourinho, Ancelotti.
He sacked a lot of them.
He sacked a lot of them. It was ruthless. If you didn't win the league title, you got sacked. Didn't matter if you won a League Cup. It was the league title or the Champions League that was the key. And that was one of the things about Abramovich, was he's very quick. Even if he bought a player or if he bought in a manager, getting rid of them, it was ruthless, completely ruthless. He built in this brand and identity around Chelsea Football Club. There's big banners in the stadium. London's first, London's finest. The only London club to win the Champions League, the first London club to win the Champions League. That's not just a banner in the ground. They use that as part of their marketing campaign. They identify as winners, also attracting some of the biggest talent around the world. So straight away, a remarkable change from a new ownership to suddenly go from a team that sometimes got a bit lucky in cups and sometimes made 6th, 5th in the Premier League, to suddenly going straight on to winning a Premier League title straight away. That's what he brought.
And the Chelsea fans didn't care where the money came from. They
Not
just wanted
at
success.
all. They still don't care. If you ask Chelsea fans now about their most successful era and you ask them about Abramovich, they still speak tremendously fondly of the time. That was their golden period. That was their huge success. And I think likewise, of course, you'll have some pockets of fans that are a little bit more concerned than others. But what happens on the pitch is really what concerns fans. If you go to the terraces of Newcastle now and you ask them about their ownership and where their money comes from, they're not too bothered. They're happy that Eddie Howe's winning stuff. They're happy that they're performing finally after so long. And I think Chelsea was exactly the same. Abramovich is absolutely loved and adored at Chelsea among the fans.
Nina.
Well, I was just going to say, it's a formula that has now been dubbed sport washing, and Roman Abramovich and his acquisition of Chelsea as a prominent Russian oligarch who didn't say much, but, from the Kremlin's point of view, was also an advertisement for Russia's riches and successes at a time when it had a much closer relationship with the West. Chelsea and his acquisition of Chelsea, and also the success he had with Chelsea, is something that has been emulated by all sorts of other countries around the world. Think of, for instance, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, recently telling an interview at Fox News, sport washing? Yes, if that's what you want to call it, I'm intensely relaxed about it, as long as it shows the results.
But you mentioned the word results. He delivered, didn't he, Abramovich, for Chelsea? I mean, he took them from pretty much nothing to household names. You see Chelsea shirts all over the world now. So we'll talk about the sanctions and the money again in a moment. But Abramovich's money made Chelsea winners.
He did, and his sort of glamour and his international man of mystery lifestyle as this sort of mysterious Russian character probably also helped, to steer that. And he had some very sort of fiery and charismatic coaches, didn't he, and captains. He had people like Frank Lampard at the time, who's a sort of ultimate London boy and still very much linked to the area of Chelsea. These are sort of London characters, and he was able to inject that kind of glamour, all the while watching on from the box with various celebrities around him, saying absolutely nothing. And this is the crucial thing about Roman Abramovich. Lots of people don't even know how to pronounce his name properly because you don't ever hear him say it. Yeah. The interesting thing about him is if you look back at his biography, this is somebody who was born into poverty in the north of Russia. He was orphaned by the age of 3 and brought up by family members. And he wasn't immediately marked for success. He had various odd jobs, including with the Russian military, until finally he struck it big in his mid-20s when he went into the world of commodities, which is obviously what Russia as a country has made its fortune on. And therein lies the secret to its success, the fact that he could marry that with the glamour and success of football right in the heart of the most expensive part of London.
Thanks, Nina. Tan, to you, it seems to be quite straightforward to freeze someone's assets, but seizing someone's assets and making use of that money is proving to be very difficult.
Yeah, like I said, in the West, we are typically not used to these concepts, right? It almost sounds like a, Eastern type expropriation or confiscation, and we don't, we tend to not, like those terms. And the EU is also having the same issue as well, same discussions. There the focus is on separating the legal treatment of frozen capital or principal funds of the Russian central bank, some 200 billion euros, I believe, and they're trying to separate. The EU is trying to separate the principal funds from the interest accrued on those principal funds. Again, with the current application of the sanctions laws, as is, you normally cannot move the principal funds around because they are frozen assets. So the question becomes, is interest, which is derived from those frozen assets, are also frozen assets? So the scenario is somewhat akin to the proceeds from the sale of Chelsea. If you did not have the frozen asset in the first place, Chelsea, you would not have the proceeds. If you do not have the principal, you do not have the interest. So this is kind of where the discussion gets stuck in terms of the practicality of it all.
So Tan, what's happening that interest?
Assets.
Tan, that interest that you mentioned, I'm guessing the interest on £2.5 billion is colossal every week. What's happening that interest?
Mm-hmm.
Where is that going?
Well, it's sitting in a blocked bank account right now, continuing to grow happily.
Wow. How do you think Abramovich...
That's the discussion. That's why I drew the parallel with the EU. The issue is the same. You have to unfreeze the assets before mobilizing them toward that certain use, one way or the other.
And tell me, Tan, how...
You don't have the legal infrastructure for that.
I know you don't know Abramovich, but how do you think someone is feeling with... He's clearly still an extremely obscenely wealthy man. How do you think he feels about this? He came to the UK, invested an awful lot of money. He is not a criminal. And because of his links to the Kremlin, he's being treated like one.
He was a public figure, right? I think if he was a lower key oligarch, living in the depths of Surrey by himself, not the owner of Chelsea or whatnot, he might have gotten away from the sanctions because he got sanctioned very early on in the process. I remember it was like early March or something. And at the time, I know his interest in Evras and steel companies and whatnot. But unlike some of the other oligarchs, he didn't strike me as one of those Putin-esque oligarchs, if there's such concept. So I thought being a public figure was to his disadvantage, because I think his daughter had a life in the UK or whatnot, so it messed everything up. And I'm really not sure if he had fully active inner Putin circle type links. I just don't know.
Thanks, Tan. Nina, you mentioned that Abramovich doesn't do interviews. I don't even know what his voice sounds like, if I'm honest. However, he has given an interview recently. There is a journalist, an author, writing a book about the sale of Chelsea, and Abramovich has apparently cooperated. And a quote that he has given is, this is Roman Abramovich speaking, "There is an old Russian saying, the dogs bark, but the caravan keeps moving, and that fits here. Whatever I do, people will always accuse me of some kind of agenda. In the end, I have done what I have done simply to try to help." So he's speaking out now.
He is. Now, what his position is, from my understanding of the sanctions back and forth, is that the UK government did agree that this money that he got a licence to sell Chelsea very quickly when sanctions were imposed, that had to be executed very quickly so that matches could carry on and ticket sales could continue. This 2.5 billion has been parked in a bank account, as we've established, ever since. But the UK government want the money from that sale to be going to only Ukrainian humanitarian efforts to try and help Ukrainians who've been affected by the war. His position apparently appears to be that all victims of the war, including obviously implicitly Russian victims, will be, helped by that money as well. So that's the sort of bit he appears to be alluding to here, saying, I just want to help. It's a very sort of, again, a typically sort of Abramovich unclear message, isn't it? It leaves some room for interpretation, and I think that's where the back and forth between the legal sides, with the UK government now threatening to sue his side to try and force the sale of this so that this money can go to the Ukrainian victims of this war that Russia is prosecuting on Ukraine. And he's obviously holding firm with his legal side. The problem is that it's a great big embarrassment for the new UK government, because critics say, well, they should have been stronger, dictating very, very clearly that the money should go to Ukrainian victims when they originally struck this deal with Abramovich's side. And we also have a government that is run by human rights lawyers. And if they cannot sort this out, it doesn't give much credibility to the whole concept of people being able to act without impunity if you have a government run by human rights lawyers who cannot then implement their own edicts in our country.
Lance, I thought it was interesting in the interview he gave to the author as well on this book about the sale of Chelsea, that Abramovich has made it clear he would like one day to be able to go back to Stamford Bridge and say goodbye. So clearly Chelsea is still very much in his heart and his thoughts.
There's no question about how much Roman absolutely adored his time at Chelsea. And it felt as if, I mean, if you look at the ownership now with Todd Boehly and you look at the relationship between Boehly and the fans, it's not great, but there's a completely different system in place. They have two different sporting directors who are hired to look at the data and hire players. Roman was very hands-on. He knew he wanted big players. And when he came in 2003, remember, Arsenal won the league in 2003, but his next season when he won the league, he spent just shy of $300 million in his first two seasons on transfers. Now, that's kind of normal now, but if you work out inflation, that was enormous back then. We hadn't seen that kind of money being spent back then. That was how ruthless he was going to be about getting success. And it also changed the entire transfer market as we know it. We hadn't seen figures like that. We hadn't seen players being, given that kind of money before. And as we touched on earlier, it has completely changed the game, where you look at there's interests from Qatar, Saudi, all of these places into the English Premier League. But to go back to your question, he would love to come back to Chelsea and the fans would give him a standing ovation. As we mentioned earlier, he's still loved and adored at the club. He's made them, whether you agree with how he did it or not. If you look at the trophies, 19 trophies in that time, you look at the managers, you look at the legends that were created in terms of N'Golo Kante, you look at Drogba, Lampard, Terry, all of these big names. That's Chelsea. When you think about Chelsea, it's that era you think about.
If you look at Chelsea where they are right now, there aren't any of those personalities. You mentioned John Terry, Frank Lampard, Didier Drogba, Cech in goal, Ashley Cole. I mean, these were big personalities that, quite frankly, you look at Chelsea nowadays, you don't know who half them are.
Massive names. And he went out deliberately and he got these players. He wanted to get Ashley Cole, for example, from Arsenal. He was able to do that. It's not easy, as you know, to go across town to your London rivals and take their best players. That's the kind of power and charisma and the brand that he built to want players to come across to Chelsea because they wanted to be part of this massive success.
Any club, Nina, would want an Abramovich-type owner, wouldn't they? I mean, he just lavished money on the project.
And after he burst onto the scene, many clubs tried to call them. Many Russian oligarchs bought British football clubs, and thereafter Thai oligarchs bought football clubs, and so on and so forth. And the model some criticise in the UK, particularly financial journalists, will say, look, inherently, this is very expensive for fans because it's becoming less about the sport, it's more about the sort of reputation laundering of some of these individuals buying some of these clubs, and the tickets are getting just too expensive, and we're sort of losing sight of the broader beauty of the game because it's such a big money sector, particularly in the UK. But one thing I did want to pick up on is that we're talking a lot about the sanctions that Roman Abramovich is subject to that are pertinent since 2022, since the onset of the Ukraine war. When you were saying, Lance, before that lots of the fans would like to see him stand on Stamford Bridge again, but there's a problem with that. His visa expired in 2018 and the UK already back then decided not to renew it. So already there appeared to have been some kind of tension between the British government back then, and we now have a new government in charge, vis-à-vis Roman Abramovich's alleged proximity to the Kremlin, which he always says he denies. He's just a businessman.
Can you ever see him coming back, or can that be lifted? Is there any way back, or is he's just part of the history of that club now?
I don't know. It does appear as though anti-Russian sentiment is quite strong in the UK and inside the EU, and there will be many people on the front bench of this current government and potentially future governments, because this is where the Conservatives and Labour in the UK and the Liberal Democrats all agree about the sanctions environment and the need to sanction people who are close proximity to the Kremlin. I can't see that changing given the broad cross-party support against some of the Russian money that we've had in London that has, infected the political system and also the world of sports, the arts and so on and so forth.
But for all his money, he's in a very tight spot, isn't he? Because if you go against Vladimir Putin, strange things can happen.
Absolutely. Lots of business people have fallen out of windows in Moscow, and people have been targeted allegedly here in the UK. So there are lots of people in the UK who are fearful for their security at the moment, especially as things get, hotter on the front line in Ukraine, vis-à-vis the war in Russia. And so, yes, I think there are many Russian oligarchs who would make that argument. But the reality is if you're worth 10 million, 100 million, it's more of a problem for you than if you're worth 14 billion, perhaps like people like these.
Thanks, Nina. Tan Al-Bayrak, thank you very much for your insight on the sanctions. Nina dos Santos and Lance Santos as well, all here in the studio with me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.